Thank you all for joining the Understanding Your ETEP Rights webinar. So I'm Josh Simmons with Prosper Sustainably. I am a consultant attorney and a collaborative strategist. I want to let you know that you can ask questions. There is no chat functionality with one another, but you can ask me questions, and I'm going to do my best to pay attention to those. Um, I it's a little hard for me to keep track of all of them, but I will look back to it every so often just to make sure. And also, too, at the end of, I'm actually going to be uploading a couple documents throughout the webinar, and I'll let you know when I do, and you'll be able to download them through GoToWebinar. And at the very end of the webinar, there's going to be a survey, and I will appreciate any feedback that you can provide. I always want to improve my delivery of these presentations and the services that I offer, and so the questions primarily revolve around that. So please complete that survey to help me improve. I want to start with a disclaimer and let you all know that this workshop is sponsored by Prosper Sustainably, which is a for-profit business that assists individuals, organizations, communities, and tribes develop and implement lasting solutions to meet their environmental and sustainability needs. This workshop is not, so this webinar is not sponsored, endorsed by the US EPA, and should not be considered a representation of their opinions in any way. So this is entirely my own opinions and thoughts as well. So just a little bit of introduction. I'm not going to get into it too much at the moment. I want to actually provide more of an introduction or background on myself related to just my ETEP work. But I did start Prosper Sustainably about a year and a half ago. Prior to starting Prosper Sustainably, I was the director of the Chumash's Environmental Office for about 7 years. I had a lot of success there in terms of growing the program, securing grant funding, and growing the staff there. I really enjoyed that experience. I've also been a training instructor now for several years, training and lecture. I lecture at UCSB in addition to offering these types of trainings as well. So some of you may have attended some of the trainings I've done through ETEP or ITCA. I will share a little more about that. And then just the variety of services that Prosper Sustainably offers are the ETEP development, strategic planning, grant writing, project management, codes drafting, so on and so forth. So I do a lot, and I've been enjoying it so far. I've been enjoying especially the tribal projects I've been working on. Just a brief overview of my consulting experience. I've done a lot of ETEP work, some GAP work plan development, some major code drafting project, tribal environmental code drafting projects, and also grant writing as well. So the agenda is, I want to run through the agenda real quick. And the first thing after I get done with the agenda, that I'm gonna go through is just a little bit of background on what's been my ETEP journey. So how did I get into the ETEP? How did I learn about those? How did I get involved in doing those? And I think ETEPs are a relatively new concept for all of us. They've only really came out during the May 2013 guidance, although I know some of you may have been involved in developing or providing input into that guidance. But I just kind of want to share how the approach, in my understanding, has evolved over time. I'm going to then talk about the webinar objective. So what is my objective in offering this particular webinar right here? And also what are those objectives relative to the objectives of my other ETEP webinar. So this one's a little bit different than any other ETEP webinar or training I've done in the past. I want to provide some context and background on ETEPs that comes from kind of the development of the GAP guidance and the interaction perhaps between the EPA headquarters, the regions, and tribes, just to kind of put this all in context for everyone. And then I'm going to go through a series of ETEP concerns, requirements, rights, and recommendations. So I'm not going to go into every single ETEP requirement in detail. That's not the purpose of this particular webinar. That's what I do in other trainings. But there's a couple that I want to focus on. So one revolves around format concerns, and there's three kind of main areas, or even three quotes from the GAP guidance that I'm going to focus on there. I want to share with you an ETEP strategic work plan example that has been developed by Prosper Sustainably, actually two different examples and templates that can be used to meet these. And those are going to be shared in the context of these concerns, rights, requirements, and recommendations. And another concern is the language or the requirement that the ETEP have the support of EPA and tribal senior officials. Developing the GAP work plan ETEP component is another thing I want to address, and also that capacity development is a continuing programmatic need. And these are maybe kind of vague and abstract right now, but they'll be more clear as we get into them. And then I'm going to conclude just generally with kind of the ETEP rights and recommendations. So this webinar itself is directed at tribal and EPA staff who this is all new to all of us. And so I believe that this information and the perspective that I share and offer and the experience that I've gained in both working with tribes and in conducting webinars and trainings will be beneficial for everybody who has to be involved in the development of an ETEP. Okay, so my ETEP experience began with the Rincon tribe in the summer of 2014. That was the first time I really looked at the GAP guidance. When I was working with the Chumash, I hadn't really got to that point yet. In fact, with the Chumash, I somehow managed to even avoid developing a tribal environmental plan, being there for 7 years. Actually, I found when I went through the GAP guidance, so I was approached by the Rincon tribe about developing their ETEP, and when I went through the guidance and saw what it was and what it required, I thought it was well written, and to me, an ETEP was a strategic work plan, and it got me excited. Like I was like, this is something that can be very beneficial to tribes, and I was excited for the opportunity to work on developing this format and these templates. So I developed this initial spreadsheet, and one thing I'm just briefly too, I'm going to try to look at the questions and the hand raises between kind of various points in the agenda. So I'm going to go through the background and context right now, and then I'll kind of check the questions and the hands raised. And I'm going to hopefully leave time at the end to answer questions very thoroughly. Throughout the presentation, I may not address all of them just because I may feel like they may be addressed at some point throughout the presentation. So in working with Rincon Tribe, I developed an initial spreadsheet template in accordance with the GAP guidance. This initial spreadsheet template for at least one major aspect of the ETEP wasn't perfect, but it did improve over time as I did more projects and as I received tribal and EPA feedback and became more familiar with the GAP guidance. I was able to kind of refine the approach and make sure that it addressed all of the ETEP requirements in the most efficient and effective manner possible. My goal has been my goal there was to develop an ETEP strategic work plan. So actually, we'll get to that in a moment. In addition, the Rincon project led to additional projects with other tribes I've been working on, and I continue to get interest from tribes and working on ETEPs together. And I've also hosted a couple different ETEP trainings as well. I presented at the last year's Tribal EPA Annual Conference. Last May, I offered an ETEP training webinar that was focused on developing an ETEP. And in September, I conducted a full-day workshop on behalf of the Owens Valley Indian Water Commission, and then 2 days later, conducted a half-day workshop on behalf of the Intertribal Council of Arizona. And I'm going to be presenting at the 2015 Tribal EPA Annual Conference with the La Jolla tribe. It's going to be partially a case study, but it's primarily more of a training on how to understand and develop an ETEP, which is going to complement this webinar right here. So my goal really in all of this has been to develop an ETEP strategic work plan, also known as a TEP, that is a valuable tool for developing, expanding, and managing tribal environmental programs on an ongoing basis. The ETEP strategic work plans, or this process to me has been about developing a strategic planning and management system that will be essential to a highly efficient and effective tribal environmental program. These approaches and templates that I'm offering and sharing are not essential, but I do believe that a good strategic planning and management system absolutely is essential to being effective. Most organizations do not have effective or good strategic planning and management systems, let alone tribes. So for me, an ETEP is a strategic planning and management system, and if approached the right way, it can be great for a tribal environmental program and meeting both tribal and EPA goals. So let me just check the questions real quick. All right, so it doesn't appear that I have any questions at this moment. I will keep going. So the objectives of this workshop are, I want to, let me just step back actually a little bit more and provide a little more about my experience. So as I've gone through and worked on these various projects and have conducted these trainings, I have been encountering some concerns with the ETEP processes that, in my opinion, if they're not addressed in I think a fairly prompt, consistent, and widespread manner, will result in these ETEPs falling way short of their potential. And I don't, I think that the possibility is that they will not be particularly, ETEPs, if not approached properly, will not be particularly helpful in clarifying, pursuing, and fulfilling tribal or EPA environmental program goals and objectives. It will turn turn ETEPs into something that the tribes and the EPA just have to do but don't really want to do and end up resisting. They'll end up being a series of one-time exercises that are just repeated every few years and end up being documents that sit on a shelf or buried on a server that really aren't used as a management tool that's going to guide the tribe or the EPA. And the reason I put on this webinar is I just believe that a potentially powerful and valuable tool that can benefit tribal environmental programs on behalf of everybody will just be lost. So that leads me to the objectives. And I want to create through this webinar a widespread understanding of the ETEP requirements per GAP guidance. And not all of the requirements, but the ones right now that I think are leading to some of these challenges and concerns that I'm talking about. Related to that, I want to discuss those evolving issues and concerns that I have been aware of and through interacting with tribes during the projects and the trainings as well. Through sharing the examples and the projects and the templates that I've been working on, I also want to help you understand what the benefits and potential are of these ETEPs, because I think that I think that they're important. I think that they're exciting. I think that they're powerful. I hope that this information that I share is going to be a catalyst to a consistent and productive resolution of these issues and concerns. I really want to avoid having these issues addressed piecemeal tribe by tribe, where the issues are resolved inconsistently and only a few tribes are aware of how it was resolved. This could result in one tribe having this resolved for them, but the other tribes who are dealing with the same things will not be aware of it, and therefore we may end up having this resolved in different ways, and I just don't think that really benefits everybody. Through this webinar and through this information, I'm hoping to remove the barriers that may prevent the EPA and tribe from maximizing the ETEP benefits in meeting their respective and mutual goals and objectives. And so I want to point out that this webinar is not a training focused on understanding, developing, and implementing an ETEP. So that's what I've done in other trainings in the past. That's what I've done in my workshops, and that will be more the focus of the session coming up in Reno. I sent an email about that to my email list as well, so you have the time and the location. But next week in Reno, I'll be sharing that, and there are resources on past webinars, past trainings I've done on this on my website, and I'll be uploading more of those as well. I do think that this webinar will complement those other trainings, because I think that it's important to understand what some of these issues, some of these concerns are, and what the potential is. All right, so now I just want to provide some context and background on the ETEPs themselves. How did they develop? Where did they come from? What was the impetus for developing this system by the EPA? And some of this is going to be my perspective, and some of it's going to be my speculation, and I will try to be clear in terms of what's my opinion and what is actually out there written. So there was an OIG, so the EPA Office of Inspector General did an audit on the GAP program and released some determinations in 2008. And these determinations are summarized here. Essentially, for many, had determined that for many tribes, it is unclear what their gap-funded environmental program goals are, and it is also unclear whether the tribes are making progress in meeting those goals. So the GAP program has the goal of advancing tribal environmental programs, which should those programs are developed to meet tribal environmental goals. And so OIG was saying that it's unclear what those goals were, and for many tribes, and for the tribes, even the tribes that do have goals, it's been unclear whether the tribes are making progress in meeting those goals. One of the fundamental issues they saw was that there had not been a framework provided by the EPA to identify and measure progress in achieving GAP-funded tribal environmental program goals. In response to this, the GAP guidance was developed by EPA headquarters, and the GAP guidance was released in May of 2013. I personally was, I was still with the CHUMASH at this time. I tended to focus on my programs. I didn't get too involved at that point in our talk or these conversations. Now knowing what I know, I actually think I would have enjoyed being involved in these things, but anyway, so some tribes, I believe, were involved in this, and I think the National Caucus, Tribal Caucus, was had some input, but I don't actually really know. I'm not familiar with what happened during that process. But the GAP guidance itself, in addition to providing other information, provides the ETEP purpose, goals, and requirements. So it fleshes those things out and tries to describe what those are. So after that was developed by headquarters and released by headquarters, it is now up to the EPA regions and tribes to develop and implement these ETEPs. And so the regions themselves are kind of responsible for administering the ETEP process. There's a certain amount of, the regions themselves have a certain amount of discretion subject to headquarters and to the GAP guidance itself. And the EPA headquarters role, according to the GAP guidance, is to provide ETEP technical assistance to the regions. And I'm not aware of what exactly is occurring to that in that respect. But basically, tribes and regions, believe both, are going through the challenge of understanding ETEP. So it's not just tribes, I feel like, that are necessarily not fully understanding what an ETEP is and what it involves, but I believe that this document came down, this requirement came down for headquarters, and I think that to a certain extent, the regions themselves are going through the challenge of understanding what an ETEP is, what it should be, how it can be most beneficial. So this is kind of where I'm segueing to my perspective and speculation. So the GAP guidance itself is a lengthy document that takes time to analyze and understand. It's challenging for tribal environmental professionals and EPA regional staff to go through this and to understand it. You all have limited time. You have dozens of pressing matters. It's an 86-page long document that reading through it once doesn't mean you understand it. It's something that would need to be come back to over and over again and integrate into your work. So on top of everything else you had going on, now this was essentially an additional requirement. So with this limited understanding of the purpose, goals, and benefits of an ETEP, I believe that the following situations and perspectives developed. So ETEPs I think are probably initially perceived and perhaps still perceived as just another thing that we need to do. So, whether that's I believe that's the perspective of both tribes and regional office staff. So, on top of everything else, now we need to do these ETEPs. Tribes wanting clarity, so tribes are being required to prepare these ETEPs. And initially, they wanted clarity on what is an ETEP, what is required of me. Just tell me what it is. Like I don't, I just let me know so I can get past this. And there, initially there's no examples available. Regions are attempting to offer an approach or approaches that may be, and to tribes when the regions are developing these approaches I think are being received. So the tribes aren't going back and cross-checking everything that's being said by the regions about how to approach this. So I think the perception of the tribes is that when a region says, a regional staff say that develop this is a way to develop your ETEP, a tribe assumes, well, this is the only way, and because they don't know any better. And from my vantage point, um, the actual attempt to offer a clear approach by the regions is in the perception of the tribes that perhaps what's being shared with them by their grant project officers, by particular regions, is being seen as the only way, which is missing the spirit of what an ETEP is supposed to be. And I'll and that what an ETEP is supposed to be is spelled out in the GAP guidance and its goals and requirements. And so that's kind of what I'm going to be focusing on during this webinar, is where that disconnect lies and how can we bridge those gaps. As a result of all this, tribes aren't thrilled about what is being required by the regions and still don't exactly understand what an ETEP is. The tribes are becoming resistant to this. I think the regions probably, to a certain extent, they're not going to say this, but they're probably kind of resistant to this. And I think everybody hates ETEPs. I don't think this is necessarily happening everywhere, but I am, through my work, I'm seeing and hearing instances of this kind of frustration of these stumbling blocks, these challenges. So I, on the other hand, have had the luxury of being able to review and dissect the GAP guidance dozens of times with lawyerly precision and the opportunity to apply it in multiple projects and trainings. So the bulk of the work I've been doing has been surrounding ETEPs. Based on my understanding, which continues to evolve, I absolutely love ETEPs. I think they're great, or at least what I think they can be. Because if they are approached properly, an ETEP can be used as a valuable strategic planning and management system to help both the tribes and the EPA clarify and meet their environmental program goals and objectives. That is why I am doing this presentation today, is to help fulfill that potential that I don't want to see lost. Okay, so can everybody, one question I had, I'm not seeing multiple questions like this. Let me just make sure everybody can hear me okay. So there was one person who said they weren't. So yes, the PowerPoint will be available after this presentation. I'm going to upload a couple different documents throughout the presentation that you can download through the GoToWebinar application. I'm also attempting to record the webinar and to post it on YouTube. I will make a link available to that as well if I am successful. So the technology seems to be working properly, but you never know. Okay, so as I mentioned, this I'm just briefly going to kind of talk about what an ETEP is. So ETEP, EPA-Tribal Environmental Plan, is what the acronym stands for. Here's a series of purpose and goals. I'm just going to kind of summarize those quickly. An ETEP is a joint EPA-Tribal Environmental Plan, which is a plan that reflects intermediate and long-term goals for developing, establishing, and implementing environmental protection programs. So the ETEPs, so these are the overarching purpose and goals. I'll come back to some of these a little bit later, and this is really what I cover in other trainings. Is not really my entire focus today, but I will be touching upon these things. An ETEP has four major, there's kind of four main components, required components to an ETEP. There is the identification of tribal environmental program priorities, including capacity and program implementation goals. So in that in itself, that component number one, I feel like is the the meat of the whole ETEP itself. And there's the additional other things are important, but I think component number one is the meat of it. It's the one that the tribes themselves are in control of. It's about the tribes' programs, the tribes' goals, objectives, and priorities. And there's a series of elements that relate to component number one. There's elements that relate to all of them, and I'll elaborate upon those a little more. Component number two, so while component number one focuses on tribal environmental programs and priorities, component number two focuses on EPA programs and priorities. I put in parentheses here that this is something that's determined by the EPA. You know, the EPA is themselves are ultimately going to have to say about what their programs and their priorities are. Just like with number one, the tribes have, are the ones that should be defining their program priorities, goals, and objectives. So in terms of a tribe preparing an ETEP, or number two is not something that the tribe is going to necessarily be able to take the lead on. So the tribe is going to have to wait for the EPA to come back to them with that identification. I'm going to show where some of those things could be integrated into an ETEP strategic work plan. But I think various regions and various project officers may be approaching this in different ways. The third one is the third of the required components is an inventory of regulated entities, and this is something that's initially being provided by the EPA for tribal review to make sure that all regulated entities are being accounted for, and that not just on reservation, but tribes may be concerned about ones off reservation or outside their trust lands as well, that they want to make sure that is incorporated into this inventory. So there's a little bit of back and forth, but this is initially provided by the EPA based on the databases that they have. And then number four is identification of mutual roles and responsibilities. I feel like that this is kind of an extension of 1 and 2. Not 1 and 2 is developing the tribal and EPA programs, priorities, goals, and objectives. And number four is really just kind of, in my perspective, just defining whose responsibility each of the particular goals and objectives are, and where those overlap. So where there's a particular goal or objective that the EPA can assist with or help with, or is going to have direct involvement in. At the same time, the tribe will have some direct involvement as well, and clarifying what's the tribe going to do to meet that goal or objective, and what's the EPA going to do to meet that goal or objective. So again, in reviewing and explaining each of these is in detail is not my purpose today. I'm going to get into some of them a little bit more, but going through this is what I do in the other trainings that I offer. So one thing that I actually want to upload and share with all of you is, so in going through the GAP guidance itself, it is a fairly lengthy document and it's challenging to go back to. I've actually gone through the GAP guidance and extracted all of the ETEP references in the guidance itself. So instead of having an 86-page document, I've been able to get it down to 16 pages, which actually includes a sample GAP work plan for developing an ETEP. And so I'm actually now going to upload it so that each of you can download it. I mean, all it is, and what I've also done, so now it should be available to all of you to download. It's just the GAP guidance itself with certain pages omitting, and where it's not a section specifically focused on ETEPs, I've highlighted the mentions of ETEPs. So it'll be a little easier, I hope, for each of you to have a reference for developing an ETEP, see where this language comes from, see what the requirements are, see what the purpose of all of this is. And I use this as a tool myself when I'm going through this process as well. So that's something that I will end up putting online as well. So, but you each have it to download. All right, so here's where I'm getting into the meat of the presentation. Of these are kind of the issues, the concerns, the rights, the recommendations, but these are areas I want to focus on. These are I feel like are the pain points of the ETEP process right now that I want to bring attention to. So the ETEP format itself, I feel like is kind of as a major one. So an ETEP is supposed to be a living tool, and in the GAP guidance, it states that ETEPs are intended to be living, usable documents for both tribes and EPA as environmental partners to use in planning and guiding our work. So, the extra emphasis on a lot of these things, underlining is, uh, the underlining is I added that underlining. It's not actually in the gap guidance itself. I just want to emphasize certain words. But, the keywords here, I think, mainly are living and usable. And that's not typically what you think of when you think of a plan, because most plans aren't living and usable. You prepare them, and then maybe you update them a few years later. So, and that's, I think, even the problem with a lot of strategic plans are, they're done every couple years. They're not living, usable documents, and they're not really very useful for a kind of ongoing planning and guiding our work. So you may go through a strategic planning process and develop a strategic plan, and you know where to go, from there. But it's not always as valuable to keep coming back to that strategic plan for that ongoing planning and guidance. Uh, so another mention of this that I want to emphasize is that another quote from the GAP guidance is the ETEP should be a living document that is actively used as a management tool by both EPA and the tribe to ensure that work is being done in support of agreed upon priorities and that progress is being made over time. So again, really a strong emphasis on a living document that's a management tool that's helping guide tribes and EPA's work uh, on these agreed upon priorities over time, and that progress can be measured over time as well, which was one of addressing one of the major OIG determinations or findings in conducting that audit. Also, that an EPA has developed. So another quote is that the EPA from the GAP guidance is that the EPA has developed this streamlined approach for a long-term planning tool that can be modified as needed. So a living tool is not a static document. It should not be a static document that goes and sits on a shelf, because if it's put in the standard format of like a management plan or some other narrative format, it's very challenging to modify. And I'm not saying there are potentially lots of different ways you could approach this. I've developed one myself, but I think it's important that it be usable, it be modifiable as needed on an ongoing basis, but also that it be streamlined. So the ETEP itself, the GAP guidance has a lot of various kind of components and elements and requirements for the ETEP. And you don't want those to be too cumbersome, so that it becomes an unwieldy tool. So I personally have attempted to combine some of those elements together to kind of have them addressed, make sure they're addressed in a streamlined way that still makes it a usable, manageable tool. And also the capacity indicator. So this is kind of separate. This is more in the Appendix 1 that focuses on capacity indicators, but I thought it was pretty relevant. But capacity development indicators and completion dates should be revised as appropriate when a tribe's needs and priorities change. So this supports, I believe, that this plan, which the ETEP itself is going to include a series of capacity development indicators, and those need to be able to be revised as tribes' needs and priorities change. And those you can't predict when those are going to change. Staff turnover happens. The tribal leadership, there's turnover. There's change in the tribal leadership. There's environmental opportunities and catastrophes, and so there's regulation changes. So lots of these things are happening. They're not going to wait until you can change the ETEP. You need to be able to change the ETEP when these things happen. So really, I think that there needs to be an emphasis and an understanding this. The whole conversation and the whole ETEP format itself needs to focus on it being a living tool. If it's not a living tool, if it's not going to be usable, if it's not going to be not going to help guide work on an ongoing basis, if it can't be updated, as needed, then I don't think it's accomplished this primary goal. And it's not even just the goal of the guidance itself. I think in order for an organization, any organization, to be able to adapt to all the things that are coming at it and all the opportunities it's presented with, uh, it is it needs a living tool. It needs something to guide it on an ongoing basis that can be adjusted as needed. So another related concern to the formats is that there's supposed to be the specific and format approach to developing an ETEP, and this is a quote from the GAP guidance, the specific format and approach to developing ETEPs may vary from tribe to tribe and region to region. So there is no one approach. I'm going to share an approach that and the templates that I've developed, but these are not the only approaches. This is not the only approach. I think it needs to be emphasized and communicated to the tribes that, they can approach this in different ways. And, the EPA has some elements of this as well. In addition, maximum flexibility is provided as to how ETEPs are developed. So this is, again, from the GAP guidance itself, just emphasizing that there is no one way, and that should always, tribes should always be aware that this flexibility exists. So the GAP guidance itself provides some examples, but key word here is these are examples. So none of these need to be adopted, and they can be, but these are just purely examples. So tribe and region may develop a streamlined document that succinctly addresses the four components. Tribal environmental assessments may be developed or modified if necessary to ensure the components are addressed. Tribes and regions may update existing documents to ensure they address the components and memorialize in a written memo or through specific correspondence the shared understanding of how these documents comprise the ETEP. And some examples elaborating of existing documents could be tribal environmental plans, tribal environmental agreements, I'm sorry, TEAs, Ts were not tribal environmental assessments, or tribal environmental agreements, tribal strategic environmental plans, etc. So, the GAP guidance provides these as examples. Ultimately, the regions may be able to dictate exactly what the tribes do. They may have that discretion, but I believe that if it's too prescriptive, I think it'll be counter to what the spirit of the GAP guidance, the letter and the spirit of what the GAP guidance was trying to accomplish. And I just think it's going to end up being off the mark. I think it's going to still be something that's not going to be as useful and productive, and it won't be a living management tool. So, kind of summarizing and talking about those concerns a little further, tribes may not be aware of the flexibility and variability. So I think, they ask the EPA, their project officers, what do I do to accomplish this ETEP? And the project officer tells them, and the project officer may not be coming across saying that this is the only way, but the tribes don't necessarily understand that they have other options as well. So I think that it needs to be emphasized that there is this flexibility and variability in how to approach an ETEP. I think tribes may inadvertently be being steered towards static ETEP documents, such as a completely narrative document in a Microsoft Word format. And I think that's the regions themselves are kind of still trying to figure this out as well. So I don't think it's intentional. I don't think it's malicious. That's what's happening, and I think there needs to be some awareness surrounding it to avoid creating these static documents that are not living, usable, streamlined management tools. So that is really that concern, is that the ETEPs themselves will not become usable management tools if that isn't the emphasis, that isn't the focus, that isn't the highest goal among everything else. And also too, if they're not streamlined, so there's all these various parts and pieces of an ETEP, if these aren't combined and streamlined, an ETEP, even if it is kind of done in a flexible format, if there's too many parts and pieces, it's going to become too cumbersome. And so, my recommendation, what I've attempted to do is combine some of these ETEP elements where possible. I think that there are some that can be addressed, but they don't have to be all addressed in separate areas. They don't have to be addressed as separate documents, and I'll show an example of that. Uh, I'm concerned that ETEPs are going to be treated, as they are now, and will continue to be treated as just another EPA requirement by both the tribes and the EPA. And I feel like that's going to be, if that perspective is the one that continues to be prevalent, then it's going to be unlikely that the ETEPs themselves will benefit tribes or the EPA in meeting environmental goals. Another concern that I think be helpful for the EPA to be more aware about, and I have become aware of and working with tribes and conducting these trainings and discussing this during those trainings with the tribal attendees, and just also from working in a tribal environmental office myself for 7 years, is that there's some concern that tribes have about committing to ETEP milestones. That if these things, if goals and milestones are put into the ETEP, that the tribe is committed to accomplishing that. If they attach a date to it, they put this milestone in there and they attach a date to it, that it needs to be accomplished, and there's no flexibility around that. And you know, I don't believe that that's what the ETEP was intended to do. I think that's what the ETEP is intended to avoid. I think with a living, flexible, adaptable, usable document, nothing is set in stone, but it's very beneficial if everything that could be done is in a centralized place. And I think it makes it much more likely that it will actually get done. And if it's not done when it's originally stated that it was going to be done, that can easily be done. It can be shifted and done at a later time in a manageable way that's clear to everybody. But it's not about an agreement committing the tribes to accomplish these milestones in a set period of time. That if they don't, they're going to somehow lose gap funding, or they're going to somehow get something against them. And so I think that needs to be emphasized and clarified, that the ETEP itself is focused on a process, rather than an actual agreement to accomplish specific things. I'll come back more to that in a few moments. And so I think that all of these issues and concerns I've talked about can be addressed by ensuring that ETEPs are approached with flexibility and are treated as living and usable management tools. So I want to share some examples of that I've developed so you can kind of see, what exactly I'm talking about. And so let me just check the questions real quick just to make sure there's. Okay. So, so somebody asked for the slides. I can, hold on a second. Let me manage the webinar stuff. So sometimes somebody else said they're on another webinar. I'll upload the slides right now. I tend to like to only offer the slides at the end because I feel like people get the slides and they kind of jump ahead and don't really focus on what's going on. Actually, no, I'm gonna wait until the very end to offer those slides. This will be recorded so somebody can come back to it later on. So if somebody's kind of reading through this stuff, that can be done at any time. But that's was a good point. Um, all right, so let me show you an example. So I'm pulling up. So this is an ETEP strategic work plan. I've developed ETEP strategic work plans that are being used to address primarily the component 1 requirements. And I'll come back and show you those in a moment again. But let me make this a little larger just so everybody can see it well enough. So this approach was developed and has evolved over time based on a detailed understanding, the detailed understanding that I've developed of the GAP guidance and the feedback that I've received from tribal and EPA representatives. My primary purpose in developing this particular format was to develop an ETEP strategic work plan that is a living, usable, and streamlined management tool. This ETEP strategic work plan primarily addresses the first of the ETEP, the first of the required ETEP components, which is essentially the only one that the tribe can do on its own without waiting for additional input or information from the EPA. It's also, in my opinion, the most important and valuable aspect of the ETEP itself. So, sometimes some of the GAP project grant project officers are referring to this portion as just the Tribal Environmental Plan, or TEP. I'm calling it an ETEP strategic work plan because it's designed to include other elements of other elements of other ETEP components as well, and I'll kind of show that to you. But I want to reiterate that this is only one way to develop a TEP or an ETEP strategic work plan, whatever you want to call it. I think it's a very good way, but not the only way. And as stated in the GAP guidance, tribes should have maximum flexibility in how they develop their ETEPs. All right, so let me show you now how this is a living, usable, streamlined ETEP strategic work plan. I'm going to show this to you in comparison with the GAP guidance requirements for an ETEP to show you how the various components and elements are addressed. The first thing you're going to notice is that that the ETEP strategic work plan I've developed is a spreadsheet. A spreadsheet has a lot of functionality that a Word document doesn't, as you will see, and I think as a spreadsheet, as a functional document, it's much less likely to end up on a shelf. There is a Word-based version of this I will share after I'm done showing you this one as well. So, but I think this is kind of the most powerful way to approach this in terms of the approaches that I've developed. Okay, so let me just come back to these real quick. So here again is the 4 required components of an ETEP. So I want to kind of go through them line by line. So as I said, they primarily focus on required component number 1, the tribal programs and priorities. And the tribal programs and priorities have various elements that have been elaborated upon in the GAP guidance, and I'm going to show you where each of these are met. So the first one is the short description of the priority. So coming back to this, so this top table is that description of the priority. So how I've organized it is, instead of just stating they're just priorities, I've organized them as priority program areas, because I just think it's a cleaner way to approach this. I think that each program area that a tribe is focused on is a priority. I think, in terms of kind of priorities, this document itself allows some prioritization amongst various goals and objectives by virtue of seeing them all together and seeing what can actually be accomplished within a given period of time, and then what can't be, and how do we prioritize what should be done now and what should be done later and what maybe shouldn't be done at all. So this has these priority program areas. So there's like air resources priority program area, there's the climate change program area. So each one has a brief description of what that program area encompasses. I'm going to focus primarily on the climate change priority program area because that's the one I fleshed out mainly for this example. So this isn't necessarily a full ETEP. This isn't as lengthy as some of the ones I developed. I just used this one with a series of examples. And the climate change was the one that I actually did a full on, I fleshed out with all the objectives for. So climate change might actually climate change initiatives may, for some tribes, fall under their air resources. Some tribes may actually have separate efforts. I think over time that climate change programs are probably going to start becoming more prevalent as we start seeing more effects of climate change out there in the world around us. So the climate change program area focuses on mitigating the tribe's impacts on climate change and adapting to the climate change impacts that occur regardless of the cause. So this covers, this area focuses on adaptation and mitigation. So very brief description. So that's how that element has been met. Tribe's long-term environmental program goals is the next element of component number 1. So now scrolling down to table number 2, you find long-term program area goals that are aligned with those program areas. And so, some of the program areas themselves are very media specific. Some are more general, like there's an education and outreach program area in a lot of the ETEPs that I've been developing. There's also a general one that covers administrative, financial, and other miscellaneous stuff as well. But most of them are going to focus on a particular kind of media area. So with each particular area, I believe, there may be 1 to maybe 5, 6, 7 goals. I mean, the goals themselves are kind of the overarching, high level things uh, that program should be focused on accomplishing. Perhaps that may be accomplished. It may not, may never actually be accomplished. So if your goal is to eliminate climate change, that is perhaps a good goal. It's one worth striving for. It's one taking steps toward, and I think it's something that we're doing. But it may not actually be achievable at this point, or definitely within a given time frame that may even involve our lifetimes. But steps toward achieving the goal of eliminating the impacts of climate change or whatever, that could is taking meaningful steps toward that is going to benefit all of us. So, these are just, 2 goals. One would be understand and proactively prepare for and adapt to climate change impacts in ways that minimize impacts to human health and the environment within the reservation. And another sample goal could be to mitigate climate change impacts, including minimizing greenhouse gas emissions that result directly and indirectly from tribal sources and activities. So one goal is focused on adaptation, one goal is focused on mitigation. And there can be other high-level goals. So that's addressing that second element. So tribes' long-term environmental program goals. This third element isn't really addressed here, although this ETEP has been this ETEP strategic work plan has been designed this way. But another element is that the GAP work plans must be aligned with ETEP long-term goals. There's lots that I've crafted this in a way where this ETEP strategic work plan is very much in alignment with the GAP work plans, and to the extent where you can actually plug a lot of the information into your GAP work plan from the ETEP strategic work plan. The next one is intermediate program development milestones. And, I've called these objectives. It's not called objectives within the GAP guidance itself, but that's what I'm calling them. Really, these intermediate program development milestones are the objectives that are going to allow a tribe in the EPA to fulfill these goals. So they have the high level goals, and there's a series of sub goals, which these milestones are what I'm calling objectives. So those are the steps that are, kind of aligned with the SMART acronym, which is specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-based. That can be, that are accomplishable within a given period of time. So let's come back. And this is the heart of the ETEP strategic work plan. So is these series of objectives or milestones that are in alignment with each priority program area and in alignment with those high level goals. So for each one, and this is just some air goals right here, I'll kind of shrink it down a little bit so you can see, is that, I've organized these by priority program area. If you look into column E right here, and that there's a series of objectives that are very specific and toward achieving those goals. So these are the intermediate program development milestones. So I believe that addresses that particular requirement. There's also a requirement of tribes. The ETEP must contain this component number 1 needs to contain the tribe's plans to manage authorized environmental programs. I have addressed this in 2 different ways. So let's pull back up the ETEP strategic work plan. So let's make this a little larger again. Let's scroll down to the next spreadsheet. So the plans, so before I show you something else, plans to manage authorized environmental programs, one, just explaining what that is, that's actually a tribe's plans to administer or manage federal environmental statutory programs. So that's going to be things like your treatment as state under the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act. So if the tribe is going to develop uh, water quality standards or ambient air quality standards that are under their TS authority under the Clean Air Act, that would kind of fall under that. It can be delegated authorities as well. So it's tribes who are going to administer specific federal environmental statutory responsibilities somehow in cooperation with or on behalf of the EPA. So, that's one thing that wasn't exactly clear in the gap guidance in terms of what that was. So the way I believe that should be addressed is, I mean, that's an objective. If I'm a tribe and I'm going to be developing water quality standards, if I'm going to be pursuing TAS for water quality standards, and then I'm going to be developing water quality standards, and then I'm going to be administering that, those are objectives. Like those are things that can be accomplished and should be integrated within the body of the ETEP strategic work plan as an objective. So um, I don't think that those need to be called out separately. That's just part of what's being done. So that is also an effort to streamline things, as opposed to having that be completely separate and described somewhere else separately. I mean, that's something that a tribe is going to want to manage and remain aware of, just like all the other objectives that they have as well. I have, however, added an additional table for those plans to manage authorized environmental programs, and it does list all the different priority program areas and states whether there is or is not any plan are not any plans to manage authorized environmental programs. So if there are for air, then in this case, so they're actually within this fictional example plan, there is, I think the tribe is investigating some Clean Air Act TAS authorities and whether they want to pursue them or not. So indicates see the objectives and milestones. So that there are some plans in there, and if you want to see what those are, then you can go back there. As opposed to writing them out separately twice, we need this to be a streamlined, manageable document. Climate change, I wouldn't say, I don't think there are any applicable, I don't think that this is applicable to the climate change area or the education outreach area, general or natural resources. There are some possibilities under the waste program area for a tribe to manage authorized EPA programs. In this case, for this example, there's none at this time. And then for the water, I think in here, there's some pursuit of TAS for water quality standards. So again, that's a yes. See the objectives and milestones to understand exactly what they are. And there, if there needs to be more than that, there just, be a separate conversation. Like, what are you doing? Where are you at in that? Like, that's a whole separate effort. It's a whole separate process. It doesn't need to be embedded within the ETEP and clogging it all up. Okay, so now another element, the last element here is the needed assistance to achieve goals and milestones. So this is the need assistance by the tribe from the EPA or from elsewhere to achieve the goals and objectives that are spelled out in the ETEP strategic work plan. This is another case too where I just, to me, if I'm a tribe and I have a need, if I need training, if I need funding, if I need technical assistance, that's an objective. I need to have an objective where I'm going to pursue that. So, obtain staff training related to climate change program area objectives. I do need training. That training is going to relate to whatever I'm doing in that particular year, wherever I'm at. So, I didn't want to actually clog up the ETEP strategic work plan with every specific training that I may need. I mean, you can, depending on, if you want. But anyways, so, I don't think that it needs to be called out separately. Perhaps there could be another, spreadsheet, but I think with every single area, the tribes do have some need for assistance. There's some need for funding. There's some need for training. There's no need to call that out separately. We need a streamlined, usable, manageable documents. That's going to be a management tool. Okay, so coming back to these. So then there's the identification of EPA priority programs and management requirements. This is going to be determined by the EPA. This is the EPA's goals and objectives. I don't know how the EPA is going to approach this. This may vary from region to region. This may vary from project officer to project officer. I really have no idea. I've seen somewhat maybe how these are being addressed, but it's still not entirely clear to me. I think it's an evolving process. But one option is to include these things within this ETEP strategic work plan. The EPA has goals and objectives, goals and intermediate program development milestones that they want to achieve as well. So just integrate these. So, if it's an EPA one, then put it in here as well. Some of them are going to be joint, some of them are going to be EPA, but if they're specific things, it's the same information. Let's make this a streamlined tool where we're all working off the same song sheet. So, again, just a suggestion, just an option, but it's really the goal is to make this streamlined, usable, living. If there's a separate document that's a narrative document, whatever it is, it's not going to be as living, it's not going to be as usable, it's not going to be as streamlined. So the third one is the inventory of regulated entities. Those are the steps for this particular one. That will be a separate document that's going to initially be provided by the EPA. That's a separate document like an integrated solid waste management plan is a separate document. You can have objective to develop an integrated solid waste management plan, to update it, to add a feasibility study, to implement it. And that's how this can be integrated into the ETEP strategic work plan as well, is that there are specific objectives about accomplishing and managing this inventory and updating it as needed. So that would be how I would say that can be combined, streamlined, make it usable and living, but that will still be a separate document. This fourth component, the identification, this is the mutual roles and responsibilities. That too, I think, can be combined into this as well. So in this ETEP strategic work plan, so let's go to the top. First of all, let's come back to this and see what this involves. Pull that up. Okay, so mutual roles and responsibilities requires a little further explanation. So this is mutual roles and responsibilities for tribal program development milestones and environmental program implementation. In the GAP guidance, it states that an ETEP should define the actual activities that the tribe and EPA anticipates conducting during the time period of the agreement. It also states that ETEP should indicate which environmental protection program capacity indicators a tribe intends to establish and a general timeline for establishing them. Okay, so let's break this down. So this is about mutual roles and responsibilities. So ETEP should define the actual activities that the tribe and EPA anticipates conducting. That's roles. So what's the tribe going to conduct? Which activities are the tribe going to conduct? Which activities are the EPA going to conduct during the time period of this ETEP? So that's where you have a roles column. You have a series of objectives. These are the specific activities. Whose role is it? So the EPA can have a separate document with their roles in it. The tribe itself, this is kind of the meat of it. I think most of the responsibilities are falling upon the tribe. The tribe is going to develop this, and then I think the EPA, when those particular activities are defined, they can be plugged straight in. It can be a separate document if you want, but I really think it makes more sense to have this all centralized. There's some activities that I know the EPA has to be involved in, like annually reviewing and updating the ETEP is a requirement of the GAP guidance. So that role right there is of the tribe and the EPA. And I'll show you a little more later, but you can filter these things out and see exactly who's filter out the roles so you can focus on which roles are the EPA ones so you can see those very quickly. All right, so that's how that requirement is met. And so, I think the time period too, so conducted with, okay, so let's go on this one. So ETEP should indicate, and this was kind of confusing to me why this was included under mutual roles and responsibilities, but ETEP should indicate which environmental protection program capacity indicators a tribe intends to establish in a general timeline for establishing them. I actually think that this would have made more sense under component number 1, but it still is an ETEP requirement. It's still something I think that this is helpful. You definitely want a timeline. I don't think it needs to be a very detailed timeline. So that's where we have the year. What year is this particular objective going to be accomplished within? And so this can represent a fiscal year. So let's just say this is fiscal year 2016, which is in reality fiscal year 2015-16. So in that fiscal year, this is the objective that's going to be accomplished. It also wants to show that indicate the Environmental Protection Program capacity indicators a tribe intends to establish. Those capacity indicators themselves, so they're addressed in two ways. One is capacity indicators themselves are just another way of reframing objectives. The capacity indicators in the gap guidance themselves, there is a capacity indicator in the gap guidance that talks about that the tribe has conducted, and so we're talking about line number 34 right here, this particular one. So there's a capacity indicator in the gap guidance that states that a tribe has conducted an indoor air quality assessment and prepared some report, and I think there might be something along the lines of them having developed an indoor air quality management plan as well. So that was really just rewritten as an objective, and the capacity indicator that that's linked to is C.3.9. So if you go to the gap guidance and find that, the gap guidance is a really good source of finding objectives that can be included within this plan. So the capacity indicators themselves are already embedded as objectives, and then I've also done it in a way where you can see the link to those specific objectives where that applies. Not everything in the ETEP needs to be related to a specific capacity indicator, and not everything gap funded needs to be related to a specific capacity indicator that's in the gap guidance. So there can and should be things in this ETEP. I mean, most of them I have are somehow maybe directly related, or maybe arguably related to a specific capacity indicator number, but there are some that are not, that the EPA can decide whether they want to fund. I think uh, yeah, so maybe a restoration, maybe that is related to capacity indicator, maybe it's not. In this case, I've interpreted that as not applicable. Um, but so that fulfills those requirements as well. All right, so I want to show you a little bit more about what these can do and how they are streamlined management tools. So, some of that I think is becoming pretty apparent, but let me show you how much more valuable this can be than especially a Word document. So this thing, if this is set up right, it has filtering and sorting capabilities that allow you to pinpoint the exact information you want to see. So in this case, let's focus just on climate change. Like all of this stuff is in the ETEP strategic work plan, but we just want to see climate change. And let's eliminate this little explanation about what the tables are. So we'll hide those so we don't have to look at that. Let's go here and let's remove everything else except for the climate change description. Let's do the same thing with the goals. So now we only see the climate change description, the climate change goals. And now let's go over here. Let's make sure we get the area, and let's eliminate all the non-climate change related objectives. So now this ETEP strategic work plan is just the climate change priority program area over the course of 4 years, and some possible activities the tribe may want to consider doing. Same thing too, you can do this for this this table as well. So now you have a filtered document that only shows the climate change related activities. You can filter them out by year, you can filter them out by a category, you can filter them out by employee staff time, you can filter them out by role and responsibility, whether it's tribe or EPA or both. So you can see all this information very quickly. If you have if you have a climate change program manager, your conversation with them is going to revolve around the objectives in this worksheet in every meeting you have with them. Where are you at with these things? If our objective in this year in line 39 is to conduct a climate change vulnerability and risk assessment and prepare a report, where are you at in that? And the details of how that's going to be accomplished are going to be included in a separate work plan. So those details themselves don't necessarily need to be included, and this is in alignment with those goals. So this is in alignment with the goal of climate change adaptation. You need to understand your risks in order to properly adapt or develop develop an adaptation plan. And there's a thread. So in this 2016, we're going to do a risk assessment, vulnerability and risk assessment. In 2017, we're going to develop a climate change adaptation plan. It's one of these objectives. So I think I'm scanning over it too quickly. So I know it's in here. It just sometimes they're, so you can refilter these by year. So that might be one thing too, is that they're not, you can sort shortest to largest. Adaptation, let's search for it just because adaptation. So develop climate change preparedness adaptation plan. I had actually manipulated this spreadsheet before because I was messing with some stuff to as an example. So that should have been in 2017. So now it is. It's a very quick change. Oops, it was in 2017 or 18. Let's move it to 2017, and then in 2018 you would have uh, implementing that climate change adaptation preparedness plan as a placeholder. You don't know what you're going to do at this point to implement the plan because you don't know what the plan is. But as you develop the plan, as you approach and get through 2017, then you can flesh out 2018, 2019. So this is also a living plan because right now it's a 4-year plan that covers 2016 to 2019. This is supposed to be updated by at least on an annual basis. I think it should be updated on an ongoing basis, but each year the activities for 2016 need to be archived, and the 17, 18, and 19 activities need to be updated, and the 2020 activities need to be added. So it remains a 4-year plan. So this isn't a process of recreating a plan every 4 or 5 years. It's you always have a 4-year plan. You put in the effort in the beginning, and you now have a management tool that's also your plan. Another thing too, which has also been kind of a concern, is that, oh, well, a spreadsheet's great, but, what if I want to print this out and show this to somebody? Like, not everybody wants to look at an Excel spreadsheet. Not everybody even wants to manage this. How do I get feedback on this? Like, I don't want my staff making edits to this and not knowing what they've edited. Okay, so the essential information was included really from columns A through D. Beyond column D, there's a lot more information in here, but it's not essential. It's not a requirement of the ETEP. It just, for me, it's what things I thought through and thought, well, what would be helpful as a management tool? What's going to help this be a tool itself? But really, in terms of submitting this to the EPA, you really only need these 4 columns right here. These address all the requirements of, that are within the tribe's control to address. So let's just highlight those. So, and let's copy those. And let's open a Word document. Let me find where I had a Word document ready to do this with. I don't know where it's at, but I'll just show you how easy it is. I'm going to open a Word document. Oh, Word is already open, that's right. So a new blank document now is going to be opened. All right, so right now it's just kind of in the lengthwise position. And just one thing I'm going to do is just change this from portrait to landscape, and now paste. And I don't like how it did a very wide one like that. That doesn't usually happen. Hold on, let me try repasting that. So let's use the source formatting on this. It usually does it exactly the way I want it right away, but anyways, just a quick little change. And now I have the ETEP climate change related strategic plan all in a Word document that somebody can use track changes for. They can print it out, they can see it all at once, they can pass it around, they can do whatever they want with it. So you can get this into a printable Word format if you want. So another thing that goes above and beyond what this ETEP is required to be and helps it be a management tool are columns like ones that link it to the GAP grant's objectives. You can put outputs and deliverables. You can put intermediate outcomes or performance measures. You can do urgency. You can do specific due dates. But one thing I really like is that you can manage your staff. So you can assign for each objective, you can assign a primary staff responsibility. You can estimate the work years associated with each objective for each staff member. So let's say that, and I can recreate this where, I can hide columns where I can see these right next to the objectives. So let's say, the climate change, line 39, the vulnerability and risk assessment right here, is going to be, the point person on that particular one is going to be the air quality specialist, AQS. There's going to be an estimate of number of work years, how long that's going to take, and then so the environmental director is going to have some involvement in that as well. If there was anybody else, you would enter some information for them. And then you actually have a pivot table report where you can see, if it's filtered just for year 2016, you can see how many combined work years each staff member has. So you can make sure it's the most up-to-date one. You got to refresh it. So I'll just show you real quick. If you look at this table, if this is all the work you've gone through, you've estimated the work years on this, and you see that my air quality specialist actually is only, I only have 0.85 work years worth of work for my air quality specialist right now. Maybe something's got to give. Maybe I need to assign something. Maybe I need to relook at some of those objectives. Maybe there wasn't enough time associated with it. So let's just go back to this particular one and look at it. So maybe 160 hours actually wasn't enough for the ambient air for the air quality specialist to do this. A realistic would be 320 hours. Let's double that, because I've talked to the air quality specialist and we've gone through the requirements of what this objective is going to require. It's going to take a lot longer than originally estimated. Let's go back to the pivot table report and refresh that, and now went from 0.85 to 0.93. So this is a management tool. Also, in terms of updating this on an ongoing basis, so let's go back here. Let's unselect the filters. If I want to start archiving things, let's say I'm at the year end or about to begin 2017, or I've just started 2017. I need to archive these things. I go through these. What's been accomplished? Did I do the monitoring for this year, the air quality monitoring for this year? Yes. Okay. So let's go put this in the archive just so we can keep track of it. And we'll want to fill in that column. Did we conduct were able to complete the indoor air quality assessment, prepare a report, and develop the indoor air quality management plan? We actually weren't able to get started. A lot of other things came up. So you know what? Well, we're going to accomplish it in fiscal year 2017. So we changed this to 2017. So you go through all of them and you do that exact same thing with all of them, and then with each year too, so you're still looking at 2017, you're going to shift things back based on what you changed in 2016, what you accomplished, what you didn't accomplish, and then you're going to add objectives for 2020, so it remains a 4-year plan. So this is really going to be guiding your department on an ongoing basis. As a director, if you leave, you have something that somebody else can step in and understand what's going on, rather than reinventing the wheel, going in a completely different direction. And this is a process. This is one that everybody's invested in. So for those that curse at the sight of a Word document, there is a Word. I created a Word version with all the same information as well. It has some instructions. So this Word version is there's one sheet for each priority program area. It has the long-term goals, the objectives with the roles, the capacity indicator numbers, and the year. So it has all the essential information, so somebody could take the same approach, streamline it, and just use a Word document as well. But it's going to be kind of more of a bulleted list format than an unwieldy narrative. So let me close those, and these will be shared. The templates and the examples will be shared with everybody as well. So these plans, I believe, must be streamlined, living and usable management tools. If they're not, they're not going to meet the goals of the GAP guidance, and more importantly, they're not going to meet, I think, the common sense goals of what these plans are intended to, what they can accomplish. So, if ETEPs are not streamlined, living, and usable, then they will not be effective in achieving tribal environmental program goals for tribes or the EPA, and people on both sides are going to dislike ETEPs. I love ETEPs, and I think they can be extremely valuable, but only if they are streamlined, living, and usable management tools. Streamlined, living, and usable management tools. Moving on. Okay, so another area of concern is what's required to authorize an ETEP. So the GAP guidance language states that an ETEP should have the support of senior officials in both EPA and tribal government, as they will be used to help prioritize the work that is funded under GAP and the work that EPA is conducting in the tribal area. So that's all it says. So the concerns here are that tribes may need a tribal council resolution. Sometimes they're being, it's being indicated by the EPA that the tribes need a tribal council resolution in order for this to get passed. So, actually it's a good segue. Let me just check the ETEP Let me just hit the questions real quick. The column on those, so the column in CI numbers is capacity indicator numbers. There aren't a maximum number of goals. Uh, and I think the best time frame for an ETEP is going to be 4 years because it's going to align with your GAP grant cycle itself, or at least how long a GAP grant cycle is. You can do 5 years, but I think really beyond 4 years, things start getting a little more fuzzy. So I recommend doing 4-year plan, but it's a perpetual 4-year plan, so it's always going to be a 4-year plan. But again, CI numbers was the capacity indicator numbers. Okay. So coming back to these concerns, so it's being indicated to some tribes, or at least they're being recommended they get a tribal council resolution, which can be difficult to obtain. Is that the executive committee? Is it the full tribal council? Is that necessary? It's problematic, and so that is a major concern. But it's not a specific requirement by the GAP guidance. I'm not saying that the EPA region can't require it. I don't have any say in that, but I think that there's some reasons why that's not effective to do either, because I think that if there is a tribal council resolution for this plan, it's going to more likely mean this is a static document that's not living and usable. But also, senior officials. So another key word here is senior officials. So it just says the ETEP should have the support, just support, doesn't state what that support is, of senior officials. So those senior officials are going to vary from tribe to tribe, and generally, senior officials is going to be somebody who's authorized to sign off on an agreement. And with your tribe, the tribal environmental director or tribal environmental manager or program manager may actually be authorized by the tribe. So who is the senior official is actually for the tribe to determine, not for the EPA to determine. So just realize that you want to determine who is authorized to provide that support, and you need to communicate this to the EPA. And if you're asking, the EPA what's required, and they give you some language, and the language includes getting a tribal council resolution, you don't have. I don't believe you have to get a tribal council resolution, at least according to the GAP guidance. A signed document. Another concern is that a signed document means a commitment to completing specific milestones. I talked about this earlier, that if there's a resolution or a signed document that all of a sudden this is kind of like a work your GAP work plan, like you have received the signature for funding for your GAP work plan, and by virtue of that signature and by accepting the funding and signing onto that agreement, you have committed to accomplishing those objectives within those timeframes. My recommendation, I don't think that's what the ETEP is meant to be. I think I think the focus of anything that's being signed should focus on the commitment to a joint planning process rather than the particulars of the plan itself. So the commitment isn't to the specific things, the specific objectives that are meeting the goals. I mean, maybe you have the tribe focus on, these are good goals, we're willing to commit to those. But those objectives in terms of meeting those goals are going to need to change over time. And the goals themselves are also going to need to change as conditions and circumstances change. So, I think that any signed document should focus on that commitment to the joint planning process rather than the plan itself or the content of the plan itself. So, and then a signed document produces a static, inflexible ETEP. So, it really just requires support, not commitment to the content of the ETEP. And I think, that needs to be emphasized on both sides. And it's not going to be, I think the EPA wants that commitment, but I don't think that's going to be as productive. If the tribe has a flexible tool it's using, I think that it's going to actually lead to the tribe accomplishing more of its goals and objectives than having the tribe commit to something that's static, that's not actually being used as a management tool. So you can get the tribe to commit to it, but the tribe's not actually monitoring it, keeping track of it. It doesn't have this management tool to allow it to achieve these objectives and goals in the most efficient, effective manner possible. Then it's actually going to be counterproductive. It's not going to be as useful. Another particular area of concern is with the ETEP component of the GAP work plans. So some tribes are being provided by language by the GAP project officer. And there's also language in the GAP guidance itself, or a sample one. And so when the tribes see this language, or they're given, provided this language with a GAP project officer, I believe that there's an assumption that the tribe doesn't have any other option. Like that this is what needs to be accomplished. It can't be done any other way. So I think it needs to be emphasized that this isn't the only way. Here's some suggested language. Like I'm not saying that project officers can't and shouldn't do this. I think some tribes especially need that kind of assistance. Or it can be beneficial, and it should be a conversation, a discussion. I think it should be more an engaging thing where the project officer needs to work with the tribes to help them understand what their options are and what direction they want to go in. What are those constraints? Can a tribe get a resolution? Should a tribe get a resolution? Who is the senior official? What are the what should be the process? What is the tribe trying to accomplish? And that's resulting in an inadvertent commitment to a tribal council resolution approval. I've seen this in ETEP work plans. I've spoken with tribes. I've seen their exact work plan language, and when I let them know that the gap guidance itself doesn't require this, they're like, well, I don't necessarily, I didn't want to go after this. I just assumed that's what I had to do. That's what my gap project officer told me I had to do. And I'm not saying the gap project officer did this maliciously or intentionally. It's just there's a disconnect. The tribes aren't aware that it's not a gap guidance requirement. Again, I suppose the regions could actually require it, but I think that's against the spirit, and it's counterproductive to what the ETEPs are trying to accomplish. I think it's also leading to an inadvertent commitment to a narrative document as well. So that I've seen the word narrative within work plans, and I think a narrative document is an inflexible document that's not living and that's not streamlined. And then the gap guidance, then there's also the gap guidance appendix 3 that has the sample. There is a sample gap work plan for developing and updating a joint ETEP. It talks about the deliverable is the joint planning agreement, not a joint, not a agreement to a plan, but an agreement to joint planning that's approved. And this is just a suggestion that's approved by the legally authorized tribal leadership and EPA regional administrator. So that's an example. It's not a requirement per se. So one other concern, which is kind of related to ETEPs, is the ongoing capacity building. So the concern here is that GAP mainly funds capacity building, and if capacity is actually built, which is the purpose of an ETEP, a tribe is going to lose their GAP funding, and that's a legitimate concern. GAP funding is the foundational funding for most tribal environmental programs. The GAP guidance states itself that capacity development is a continuing programmatic need. So I'm trying to alleviate this concern because I don't think, I think there's some misconception here. I think perhaps both among tribes and even the EPA project officers and regions that are implementing this. So it states that developing and establishing and maintaining environmental program capacities is an ongoing effort requiring capacities to evolve as the tribal environmental program itself expands and undertakes additional challenges. So these are ongoing efforts. So the emphasis there that these are supposed to be changing. Your capacity building is going to be an ongoing effort. Your program is going to evolve. Your capacity is going to evolve. Your program is going to expand. That's going to continue to be capacity building. Another quote, EPA from the GAP guidance, EPA also recognizes that GAP resources provide a significant foundation for maintaining tribal environmental program capacities over time. So GAP guidance states a recognition that GAP funding is the foundation of tribal environmental programs. Another quote, tribes that have successfully developed capacity in a given area can continue to receive GAP funding to expand, enhance, or evolve their capacity. So just because you've achieved a particular capacity doesn't mean game over, your GAP funding is being taken away. There's a way to go about this. It doesn't mean you can keep getting funding for the same exact thing over and over again. But so the GAP guidance provides some examples I'm going to share. So GAP guidance establishes ETEPs to document, so this is another quote, GAP guidance establishes ETEPs to document the tribe's program development goals. Tribes should reevaluate their program capacity development goals on a regular basis to ensure their systems, procedures, and policies are still appropriate and to determine if additional capacities are needed. So these capacity indicators need to be evolved and they need to be updated and they may be repeating. So some examples of evolving capacity provided in the GAP guidance itself are a tribe with a community education program may continue to receive GAP funds to expand the program by adding new features such as outreach strategies for vulnerable groups. So, changing your program from focusing on adults to children or the elderly or people in poor health or expectant mothers, or another example is identifying a new media outlets to reach target audiences. So if right now you're just doing workshops, you're doing mailings, you could develop a website, you could develop social media. So that's how you continue to deliver your education outreach, by evolving your capacity to do so. Another example from the GAP guidance is a tribe with a basic water program may continue to receive GAP funds to expand their water program by adding new baseline data to their existing program. So you did an initial baseline analysis, but you didn't do all the data. You didn't get heavy metals. So you do baseline data for heavy metals. You could develop additional laboratory analysis, quality assurance plans. You could develop, or you could add capacity to share additional water quality data across multiple data platforms. You could share on the internet. You could share it through GIS databases. So those are examples from the GAP guidance. Here's an example that I've been integrating into GAP work plan, or ETEPs. But I just want to share a more tangible example that I think meets a strong area of need. So education outreach is something that tribal environmental programs need to do on an ongoing basis. And so, you don't want to get to a point where you developed all of your waste management education outreach capacity and you can't do it anymore, or even all of your education outreach capacity, because that's what the community expects. They expect you to hold those workshops. They expect you to develop, they expect you to prepare and release those newsletters. So in 2016, your focus could be on developing and testing education outreach focused on composting. This is all waste management related, focused under your waste management priority program area. 2017, develop and test education outreach focused on illegal dumping. 2018, you shift to source reduction. 2019, you focus on recycling. 2020, it might focus on household hazardous waste. And then every 5 years, these things get outdated. They must be updated. So you can, in 2021, you can go through it again. So they can be 4-year cycles, they can be 5-year cycles. So there's 2 important points. One is you are continuing to deliver waste-related education outreach activities. So, how you develop and test these activities and materials can be through some of the same methods. You're focusing on content. So you're focusing on content as composting. You can still do this through all your workshops and through your newsletter. You're changing the emphasis there. And then after 5 years, that composting stuff is outdated. You need to redevelop and retest that information. So, and it's also going to be outside of a GAP grant cycle. So you're not going to see the same work plan commitment or component in that GAP work plan cycle as well. So it kind of meets the need of not showing any kind of duplicates within a particular GAP grant. Okay, so just to conclude now, I know I'm going a little bit over time. And let me just check questions real quick. How does the PPG fit into this? I think the PPG is the same thing. I think you're developing the same information for PPG as well. So my recommendation with your ETEP is not to limit it to GAP activities. In fact, when I work with tribes, I have them include everything that all the programs and all the initiatives that the environmental department does, even if they're not environmentally related. So if your tribal environmental personnel or your director is also a TIPO, I think it's important to have a section here that's, and you don't have to provide that part to the EPA, but as a management tool, you need to understand the resources, the time that you're dedicating to doing that TIPO related stuff, because if you were doing TIPO stuff, that's less environmental stuff that you can oversee and do. So as a management tool, include everything. If there's sensitive information, let's say the tribe is pursuing water rights, the environmental department's been responsible for helping the tribe pursue water rights, investigate water rights, and that's maybe a sensitive topic in your particular area or with your tribe. The ETEPs themselves could be, subject to FOIA. So if it's sensitive, don't include it. I think the majority of stuff isn't going to be sensitive, but if it's sensitive like that, don't include it. So you can filter out some of those non-environmental, non-EPA, sensitive related things from what you submit to the EPA. But as a management tool, you want to see all those things, because if you don't, you're not going to be able to efficiently and effectively allocate all of your staff and resources to accomplish your goals in the best manner possible. All right. So the final points and conclusions, kind of, I think, my kind of the rights and recommendations are that um, tribes, you have as a tribe and as the EPA, you have a right to create widespread awareness of this essential ETEP knowledge. I think it's important that all tribes are aware of what I've gone through in this webinar because that's where the disconnect, that's where the messiness, that's where the ETEPs go down the path of it not being as useful of a tool. So especially that an ETEP should be a living and usable management tool that is developed with maximum flexibility and only requires the support of senior EPA officials. So I think it's important to create widespread awareness that this is what the GAP guidance says and requires. I'm not stating that regions can't trump this somehow and they can't require something more specific, but tribes can't have a dialogue and conversation about what's going to be most efficient and most effective if they're not aware of kind of this is the crux of it. This is what all the conversations should be revolve around. So, you know, tribes in the EPA have the right to share this information with other tribes, and EPA also has the rights. And I think it's important to expect that this information will be shared. Um, and also expect consistency, and I think tribes have a right to expect consistency in how the ETEP requirements are being communicated with them. So it shouldn't be in a piecemeal manner. It shouldn't be just in addressing an issue that each tribe raises individually and working with their project officer. I think it's important that they expect that if there's an issue raised by one tribe that's a significant issue that affects other tribes, a tribe should expect that that issue and how it was resolved is communicated with them as well. I think tribes can expect questions from the EPA about how the gap guidance requirements are being met in the EPA that they're delivering. So it's this is a two-way street. When you're submitting your ETEP strategic work plan, whatever you submit through the ETEP, the EPA, you can and should expect questions in the EPA. They want to make sure the gap guidance requirements are being met. So you may need to provide some type of written explanation about how those are being met. And I think you can also expect the EPA to accept reasonable justification for approaches that vary from what they've seen in the past. So if you come up with a new approach, you come up with a different approach, and if they don't accept that justification, you have the right to request their reasons in writing. And I think it's important to do so. You also have the right to involve EPA gap managers, so the people who are supervising your project officer. You have the right to involve headquarters and headquarters who ultimately drafted the gap guidance. You have the right to involve them and also officials. So you can involve, you can make sure that the senior EPA officials are involved in this as needed. So you can contact and discuss these concerns directly with those managers, those supervisors, with headquarters, and or copy on emails. So the headquarters contact, there's a general one. The emails provide right here. Here's the number as well. I'm encouraging this because I think there needs to be some level of consistency. I think it needs to be a high level conversation. I hope and want to see tribes bring this to the level of headquarters because I think ultimately it's going to help get these things resolved and help make these things as beneficial as they can be, not just for tribes but for the EPA. I ultimately believe that this will be beneficial to the EPA regions themselves to have some clarity and have everybody on the same page. So here's a link for some of the senior officials over at the headquarters, the American Indian Environmental Office of EPA as well. So you could contact specific people who are listed there. And also you can consider involving your tribal officials and leadership. Also engaging in widespread awareness of I think you have the right to engage in widespread and high level. I think it's important to engage in widespread and high level ETEP policy conversations about how this is being addressed. So through our talk, through the caucus conversations, and then through evolving headquarters. And I think it's you have the right to effectively advocate for constructive changes to this process, whether you're the tribes or the EPA. I think EPA GAP grant project officers also, where they see there's room for improvements, I think that they have the ability to advocate as well. And finally, I think that everybody has a right to expect an ETEP that is a powerful and valuable strategic planning and management tool for advancing tribal environmental goals. And I believe that all of you should settle for nothing less. So thank you very much.